We'll begin the afternoon session. To remind everyone, we postponed the votes for the immunization schedules until tomorrow morning. The votes this afternoon will be for the pertussis vaccines and for pertussis VFC. So let's begin with pertussis vaccines with Dr. Fiona Havers.
Thank you. So moving on to the Tdap vote. So the proposed policy change under consideration is whether recommendations should be changed to allow either TD or Tdap vaccine to be used in situations where only TD vaccine is currently recommended for the decennial TD booster, tetanus prophylaxis for wound management, and the catch-up immunization schedule, including in pregnant women. And here is the proposed language that is under consideration.
So would somebody like to make a... It's been motioned, that's right. All right. So do we have a second? Okay. So any further discussion? All right, are we ready to call the vote? Yes, okay. So we'll begin voting. Please indicate yes or no in favor of the proposed language changes. And we will start with Dr. Lee to my right.
And can I just ask, can I just remind the members to please indicate if you have a conflict of interest?
Lee, no conflicts, yes.
Sanchez, no conflict, yes.
Alt, no conflicts, yes.
Bata, no conflicts, yes.
Talbot, no conflicts, yes.
Atmar, no conflicts, yes.
Szilagyi, no conflicts, yes.
Bernstein, no conflicts, yes.
Paling, no conflicts, yes.
McNally, no conflicts, yes.
Hunter, no conflicts, yes.
Bell, no conflicts, yes.
Fry, no conflicts, yes.
Romero, no conflicts, yes. So the motion...
Yeah.
The motion carries unanimously and is approved. Do any of the members feel a need or the desire to clarify their vote? None being. All right, so that's carried and passed. Next is the TDAP VFC resolution vote. And we will have to make a motion for that. Okay, and this is Dr. Santoli.
Hey there. I'm going to put up the language for the resolution. So I'm going to show you the whole resolution, and the wording that is in white is unchanged, and it is the wording that is in yellow font where there are changes were made. So the purpose of the resolution is to update the language in the Tdap component of the resolution to be consistent with the most recent ACIP recommendations for routine and catch-up vaccination, as well as tetanus prophylaxis for wound management. The eligible groups are unchanged. The recommended schedule and intervals for the DTAP component is unchanged, and the notes for the table are unchanged. This is the table for the Tdap component, and the first footnote has been updated. It's actually just updated to mirror the language in the ACIP recommendation. I'm sorry, that's the second footnote. The first footnote is a standard footnote to make clear that what we say about here in brands is not meant to express any preference. And the second footnote is just directly from the ACIP recommendation. The third footnote about catch-up recommendation is changed. It has the TD or Tdap language, but it also now reflects the language that is in the ACIP recommendation. And I'm going to give you a minute to look at that. The fourth table note is not changed. The fifth table note about tetanus prophylaxis for wound management is now updated to use the same language as the ACIP recommendation with the addition of the TD or TDAP. And the sixth table note is unchanged. The information about recommended dosages, contraindications, and precautions is unchanged. And the statement about incorporating future publications by reference is unchanged. And that concludes the VFC resolution.
Dr. Talbot.
I didn't get a chance to read number 5. Is it possible?
Sure.
Please, yes, thank you. And if anybody else on the committee did not have a chance to read a particular section, please let us know. Go back, please. Any other changed sections that you wish to review? All right, very good. Do I have a motion to accept?
I move that we accept the wording for the VFC approval for the changes in TDAP.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Hunter. Second, please. Dr. Alt. Dr. Alt. Thank you.
I second.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion or need of clarification? Okay. So we will begin voting, and we will go to the right of Dr. Talbot.
Talbot, no conflicts, yes.
Atmar, no conflicts, yes.
Szilagyi, no conflicts, yes.
Bernstein, no conflicts, yes.
Paling, no conflicts, yes.
McNally, no conflicts, yes.
Hunter, no conflicts, yes.
Bell, no conflicts, yes.
Fry, no conflicts, yes.
Lee, no conflicts, yes.
Sanchez, no conflict, yes.
Alt, no conflicts, yes.
Romero, no conflicts, yes.
Bata, no
Sorry about that.
conflicts,
Sorry about
yes.
Yeah. So all voted in favor. The motion is carried. Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to the next topic, which is influenza vaccines. The introduction will be given by Dr. Atmar. They're not there.
All right, we get to talk about flu this afternoon. Let's see here.
For the members that are looking for it in the computer, it's not there, but it is in your handout. So.
Okay. So here's a work group. We have several ACIP members that are members of the work group, including Drs. Alt, Bernstein, Szilagyi, and Talbot. We have a robust group of other members, including ex officio and consultants, liaison representatives. And of course, Lisa is you met this morning, is our work group lead. A recap of the influenza session from our last meeting is that information on influenza surveillance and vaccine effectiveness updates was provided. An overview of the 2018-19 influenza vaccine safety surveillance was also reviewed. And the proposed recommendations for the 2019-2020 influenza season were given and approved. So since that time, the 2019-2020 ACIP influenza statement was published August 23rd of this year. We've had the work group has had a series of discussions to develop a protocol for a systematic review of influenza vaccine in older adults with a selection of relevant comparisons and outcomes, both for safety and effectiveness. And we had a presentation of a phase 3 trial data for the quadrivalent high-dose inactivated influenza vaccine for persons 65 years of age and older. And today, Ms. Lynette Brammer is going to update us on U.S. influenza activity. It'll be followed by a presentation by Dr. Li Jia Cheng from Sanofi on the QIV high-dose clinical development and the phase 3 safety and immunogenicity study results. And then we'll conclude with Dr. Grosskopf giving us a summary of what the work group has done and what our considerations are. So, Ms. Brammer.
Thank you, and good afternoon. This afternoon, I'll provide a brief update on international influenza activity, followed by recent U.S. influenza activity, and then talk briefly about the Southern Hemisphere vaccine recommendations. This first slide shows Southern Hemisphere influenza activity for the past year, as reported to the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System at WHO. And what you can see from this is that basically we have all the possible viruses in circulation. In the blue shades, you can see the light blue is influenza AH1N1 viruses. The medium blue is H3N2 viruses, and then the darker blue is just A viruses that weren't subtyped. And then the gold-colored bars are influenza B viruses. The very light ones are B Yamagata lineage viruses, and the medium shade is the B Victoria lineage viruses. So worldwide, we've had some of everything. But if you look at a couple of selected countries, you can see that there are differences by country. The first graph on the upper left, it shows Australia, and you can see that although they had H1 activity during their summer months leading into their season was predominantly influenza AH3N2 viruses with some influenza B. In contrast, on the right upper side is New Zealand. They also had predominantly H3 among their A's, but they had more influenza B, and it was B Victoria lineage viruses. New Caledonia, on the other hand, had a very strong early H1 season, followed by a second wave, which was mixed with H3 and B Victoria. And then to round it out, South Africa had an almost exclusively H3N2 season. If we go on to the next slide and look at a couple of countries in South America, you can see there's quite a contrast. Brazil saw an H1N1 predominant season over the last year with some H3N2 activity and some B activity, with the Bs being predominantly B Victoria. If you look at Chile on the right, you can see they also had an H1 predominant season with some H3 activity. But at the end of their season, they had a pretty substantial influenza B wave. And what's really unusual about this is the predominant influenza B virus they saw was B Yamagata, which has been pretty rare over the last year. Moving on to U.S. influenza activity, this slide shows influenza positives reported to CDC by clinical labs across the country for the past year. And what the inset is the more recent data, and what you can see is in recent weeks, influenza activity represented by the percent positive in the dark line has been increasing slightly, as we would expect for this time of year. The unusual thing is that the majority of the viruses reported to us by clinical labs recently have been influenza B viruses, which is a little bit unusual for this time of year. But of note, among those influenza B positives that have been reported, well, 71% of the viruses reported over the first 2 weeks of this season have been influenza B viruses. But 85% of those influenza B viruses come from region 4, which is the southeast United States. And I'll show you a graph and a map in a minute to show you how things are sort of distributed across the country. So if you want a more balanced view of the virologic data, this next slide shows the influenza positives reported to us by public health laboratories across the country. And you can see there is still a lot of influenza B activity reported recently in the green bars, predominantly B Victoria lineage viruses, but overall H3N2 viruses have been more frequently reported. For the first 2 weeks of the season, 68% of the viruses reported by public health labs are influenza A, and only 32% are influenza B. Among the influenza A viruses that have been subtyped, 73% of those have been H3N2 viruses, and among the influenza B viruses with lineage information, 93% of those are the B Victoria lineage virus. This next map is, the numbers in this map are really small. The pie charts show the relative proportion of viruses in each of the different regions. And total, this is only 2 weeks worth of data. It's only 176 viruses. But what you can see is that in the southeast, in region 4 is B predominant. Region 6 is also B predominant, but that is mostly Louisiana and Texas contributing that data. And then up the East Coast is more influenza B, but across the north and down into the West Coast are A predominant. So some pretty marked differences by geography right now. If we look at the viruses more closely, look at their genetic and antigenic characterization, this is data, the data I'm presenting was for viruses collected between May 19th and September 28th. That's weeks 21 through 39, or the summer weeks. And these are data that include viruses submitted by both international and U.S. laboratories and tested at CDC. And I'll start off with the two easy ones first. Among the H1N1 viruses, all of the viruses belong to a single genetic subclade, the 6B1A group. And 96% of the ones that have been antigenically tested are similar to the cell-propagated 2019-2020 Northern Hemisphere vaccine virus component, which is an A. Brisbane 02 2018-like virus. The B. Yamagata viruses all also belong to a single genetic group known as Y3, and all of them are similar to the cell-propagated Northern Hemisphere vaccine component, which remains B. Phuket 3073 2013-like virus. Now, moving on to the more interesting data, the influenza A H3N2 viruses, during this period, again, this is US and internationally, CDC tested 427 of these viruses genetically, and they all belong to one of two clades, the 3C2A or 3C3A clades. 83% belong to the 3C2A clade and 17% to the 3C3A clade. Within the 3C2A clade, though, there are multiple subclades currently circulating, and the majority of those belong to a subclade called 3C2A1. The 3C2A1 viruses are what predominated in Australia during their influenza season that's just coming to a close, but the 3C3A viruses are what predominated among the H3 viruses that circulated in South America during their season. 70% of the antigenically characterized H3N2 viruses are similar to cell culture propagated 2019-2020 Northern Hemisphere vaccine virus components, which is for this season an A Kansas 14 2017-like virus that belongs to the 3C3A clade. So while ferret antisera can show distinct changes between these two clades of viruses, there is some cross-reactivity between the two groups of viruses, hence the 17% 3C3A viruses, but 70% antigenically similar. Moving on to the influenza B Victoria lineage viruses. The B Victoria lineage viruses have all either belong to the V1A clade, which is 4% of the viruses during this time period, or one of the two subclades, the V1A1, which had 24% of the B Victoria viruses, and the V1A3 Del genetic group, which accounted for 72% of the B Victoria viruses during this time. Looking at antigenic characterization, the V1A1 viruses antigenically characterized were similar to the cell-propagated vaccine component for this year, the B Colorado 06-2017-like virus. And ferret antisera raised against the V1A1 viruses had reduced reactivity with V1A and V1A3 Del viruses, indicating that there are antigenic differences between these different B Victoria lineages. However, when you test these with human sera, people vaccinated with a V1A1 virus, their sera cross-reacted well with V1A3 Del viruses, which are the predominant virus circulating recently. Moving on to illness activity, this graph shows the percent of patient visits to ILI net providers for influenza-like illness. For the first 2 weeks of this season, 1.5% of patient visits have been for influenza-like illness. If you look closely, it looks like this is a little bit higher than what we've seen at the start of other seasons, but we added some new sites, and with the addition to those sites, the baseline increased from 2.2 to 2.4, so we don't think this increase is really representing increased activity. It's just a different mix of providers that are reporting. If we look, however, at influenza-like illness activity on a state level, the thing that jumps out at you here is that for week 41, which ended on October 12th, Louisiana is already seeing high influenza-like illness activity, and the Virgin Islands are seeing low activity. All the remaining jurisdictions are seeing minimal activity. That activity in Louisiana is associated primarily with B Victoria lineage viruses. To look at it a little bit different way, this is a map of the geographic spread within each state of influenza, and you'll see again, Louisiana does stand out. They are our one state that last week reported regional influenza activity. In addition to that, we had 3 states reporting local activity. Majority of states reported sporadic activity, and we had 3 states that reported no influenza activity last week. As you would expect, with low activity, if you look at pneumonia and influenza-associated mortality from the National Center for Health Statistics, you see that the percentage of death certificates with pneumonia or influenza listed on the death certificate are low. This is data for the week ending October 5th, when 4.7% of the death certificates had pneumonia or influenza listed somewhere on the certificate, but this is well below the epidemic threshold of 5.7 for that week. So far, for the 2019-2020 season, there have been no influenza-associated pediatric deaths reported. However, we did have 2 influenza-associated pediatric deaths reported in September, and both of those were due to influenza A, H3, and 2 viruses. The WHO committee met in the end of September to make recommendations for the 2020 Southern Hemisphere influenza vaccines, and they recommended the following. They recommended an A. Brisbane 2 2018 H1N1 PDM09-like virus, which is the same as is in our current vaccine. An A. South Australia 34 2019 H3N2-like virus, which belongs to the 3C2A1 subclade, and it does differ from our vaccine. And the other update was a B. Washington 02 2019-like virus for the B. Victoria lineage component, and that is a V1A3 Del virus. For quadrivalent vaccines that contain two B components, they have the three above plus the B Phuket remained in the vaccine. And keep in mind that these vaccine recommendations are made for what is expected to circulate in the Southern Hemisphere season during what will be our summer of 2020. So to summarize, overall influenza activity remains low in the U.S. The numbers are so far are small, but influenza H3N2 viruses are predominant in the U.S. overall, but there's a lot of variability by region. It's really too early to tell what viruses will be predominant for the season. And keep in mind, frequently summer influenza activity doesn't predict what is going to happen here in our season. While two of the four vaccine components were updated for the Southern Hemisphere, recent lab data suggests that the components selected for our Northern Hemisphere vaccine at this time still look like the appropriate selections for us. That's all I have right now, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We'll open it up to the voting members to see if they have any questions or comments on this presentation. Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I actually have to say I didn't really appreciate the geographic variability until you shared that with us today, or maybe I've missed it before. One of my questions is related to whether or not you can predict the genetic and antigenic characteristics of the flu viruses by region in the U.S. based on travel patterns from other countries.
I cannot. I think it's really hard to predict which genetic groups are going to win out regardless of geography. You know, the fact that you can have just different subtypes predominate in places that are fairly close, like Australia and New Zealand. I don't think there is a, you know, there are methods whereby they put in all the genetic data for worldwide and try and predict which among those are going to emerge and predominate. But I've not seen that data on a finer geographic level. Dr. Dave Wentworth back there, he can probably answer that question better than I could.
Yeah, I think there was a fine answer. We don't do it at that fine grain level at individual localities. Because it probably wouldn't work, yeah.
Any other questions? Dr. Stinchfield.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Your comment about the September pediatric deaths, are those counted in last year then because they were early? And then my second question related to that is because they were so early in September, do you look at international travel as a potential that it wasn't a U.S. influenza, that it was from somewhere else in the world?
Those do, for your first question, those do count as 18-19 season. Whether or not that's really correct or not is up for question, but those will count as deaths for that season. And yeah, there is concern that those viruses that caused illness early in September could be travel related.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, very good. So
Thank you
we'll-
very much.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next presenter, Dr. Chan from Sanofi Pasteur, who'll give an update on high-dose inactivated flu vaccine.
So good afternoon, and thank you to the working group and to the ACIP for inviting me to come and present our data. So to first start off with some background on our quadrivalent high-dose influenza vaccine, which I'm here today to present to you. So it's building off of our currently existing licensed trivalent high-dose influenza vaccine, which has been licensed since 2010. We've had over 115 million doses delivered, and about 2 out of every 3 adults 65 years of age and older in the past season received our trivalent high-dose influenza vaccine. So as with most other vaccines, our high-dose vaccine is the last one that hasn't transitioned over to our quadrivalent formulation. And I'm here to show you the QHD13 data, which is the study that we use to immunobridge from the trivalent to the quadrivalent formulation in order to make sure we have good coverage for both of the different B lineage strains. So highlighted in the red box here is the QHD13 study. I do want to make sure that you have a good broad overview of our trivalent high-dose vaccine and the data that has already been generated in it. So shown here are all of the key studies that have been generated since licensure, as well as real-world evidence data that's been generated as well. So you see the strengths of the data that the quadrivalent high-dose vaccine is building off of, this foundation of a large amount of data that has almost 10 years worth of the data. So it's many years that we've been evaluating this. The colors are denoting that there's different study designs that we've also looked at the benefit of the vaccine. There are different populations evaluated in these studies, from community dwelling to nursing home to veterans. And as shown in the next slide here, we've looked at also multiple different endpoints besides the traditional influenza-like illness endpoint. So this data is a new meta-analysis that was done and presented at Options 10 in Singapore in August. And it shows all of the most recent randomized control and observational studies that I showed on the previous slide in this meta-analysis. So again, today I'm going to talk to you about the QHD13 study. So an overview of the study, there were 2,670 adults, 65 years of age and older in our study. Most of the subjects received QIV high dose. It was a 4:1:1 randomization. There are 2 different TIV high dose formulations. The TIV high dose 1 depicted here was the licensed product for that season. And then the TIV high dose 2 contains the alternate B lineage in order for us to do comparisons with the quadrivalent high dose group. And so the primary objective of the study was to demonstrate non-inferiority between the 2 groups. So it's done at 35 sites across the United States, and it occurred in the 2017-2018 Northern Hemisphere season. This is a table of the high-level demographics for gender, age, and racial origin. So you can see that all 3 of the groups are balanced. There were more females than males in the studies. There were about a third of the subjects 75 years of age and older, and most of the subjects were Caucasian. This is a safety overview table. So you can see the QIV high dose group here in the yellow middle column versus the TIV high dose, which is pooled together for the safety comparison. So there were no related deaths and no related adverse events of special interest in any of the groups. There were low rates as well as similar between the 2 groups. This is the solicited reactions overview. So you can see any solicited reactions is on the far left. The blue bar is the quadrivalent formulation, and the red bar is the pooled TIV high dose groups. So you see similar levels of rates of the solicited reactions that are being reported, both for the solicited injection site and the solicited systemic reactions, as well as low grade 3 reactions for both. Then the unsolicited adverse events is all the way on the far right, which was also similar. This is splitting out specifically for the local and systemic adverse events that we did collect. So pain was the most commonly reported local reaction, and myalgia was the most common systemic. So a summary of the safety results. While you did see there are some very slight higher percentages for some of the solicited reactions, overall the two groups are comparable. I do want to note there is one related SAE in the study. It was in a subject who reported small fiber neuropathy 42 days after high-dose vaccination. So it was the QIV high dose that they received. They had other concomitant etiologies that were documented. They had a recent viral illness a week before that had started, as well as recently being diagnosed with vitamin B12 deficiency and being started on supplementation. So our sponsor assessment was that we considered it unrelated. However, it was considered related due to the investigator's judgment. Here are the two key immunogenicity results. So for the GMTs between the two groups, again, the blue bars are the quadrivalent formulation and the red bar is the trivalent formulation. So non-inferiority was defined as the lower bound of the confidence interval being greater than 0.667, which is all the way at the bottom in the footnote. And I highlighted here in green for you the 4 lower bound confidence intervals for the 2A and 2B strains. All of them were above the cutoff of 0.667. So by GMTs, the QIV high dose and TIV high dose formulations were considered non-inferior. And here was the other endpoint, which is seroconversion rates. So seroconversion rates were defined as non-inferior if the lower bound of the confidence interval was greater than -10%. And again, in green at the bottom, I highlight the lower bound confidence intervals for all 4 of the strains were greater than that cutoff margin. Just want to highlight one of the secondary endpoints was to demonstrate the benefit of having the additional B strain. So we looked at superior immune responses both for the GMTs and seroconversion rates. Those lower bounds were defined as greater than 1.5 for the GMT and greater than positive 10% for the seroconversion rates. And for both the B Brisbane and B Phuket groups here, we did show that there was superior immune responses both by GMTs and seroconversion rates. So again, the take-home overall key results, safety results, no safety issues were identified in our study with the quadrivalent high-dose influenza vaccine. Both the primary objective was met. It was non-inferior, both by GMTs and seroconversion rates. The secondary objective showing the additional benefit of the B strain by GMTs and seroconversion rates was also shown. And the study results demonstrate that the addition of a second influenza B strain in our quadrivalent high-dose influenza vaccine did not impact the safety or immunogenicity of the other 3 strains in adults 65 years of age and older. So our next steps, we have already submitted the CTD, and the CBER action date is coming up. It's November 4th of this year. Assuming that we have licensure, healthcare providers will be able to pre-order in Q1 of next year. And in the next influenza season, starting next September, we will fully convert from the trivalent to the new quadrivalent formulation. And again, in summary, I show you the QHD13 study over here in the tan in the far right. So just a reminder that Sanofi Pasteur remains committed to continuing to evaluate our vaccine in all these studies, both post-licensure, real-world evidence, looking at the safety and benefit of our vaccine in the population. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Any questions from the committee? Any questions from the liaisons or others? All right, very good. Thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Dr. Grosskopf, working group considerations.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Before starting, in addition to thanking our work group members who are extremely generous with their time and mental energy on our twice-a-month calls and beyond those, and who were listed in the slide in Dr. Atmar's introduction, I want to thank the CDC staff who contribute regularly to our calls every month, twice a month, and who often give presentations to our group. And those individuals are listed here. Thank you very much. And also to our work group members. Before getting into the work group considerations, what we've been talking about the last several months and where we plan to go in the next several, we hope, I have a very brief influenza vaccine distribution update for you. I have a slide here to which I'm grateful to Dr. Jeannie Santoli and her group in ISD for getting this data together for us. You may remember that in June, we made note of the fact that the selection of the H3N2 component of the 2019-2020 Northern Hemisphere season vaccine had been delayed. It was delayed by approximately a month. Instead of at the February WHO meeting, it was delayed until March 22nd. So there had been some questions about whether that might have implications for supply. We had a slide at that time that summarized the projected start dates for distribution of the vaccine from the various manufacturers, and it appeared that we were looking at sort of a mid-August to early September timeframe. This slide here, by way of an update, summarizes influenza vaccine supply in terms of cumulative doses of vaccine distributed by month over the course of 4 seasons. The most recent season, the one we've just started, the 1920 season in the very short black line, and the 3 previous seasons to that. By mid-October, October 11th, for the current season, 1920, approximately 127.6 million doses had been distributed. If we compare that to the recent 3 previous seasons for the same time period, mid-October, it's a bit less than what we had last season, 18-19, which is in blue, but it's actually a bit more than what we had in 17-18 and in 16-17, which are the yellow and the maroon lines, respectively. As a reminder, it's anticipated based on manufacturer estimates that a total of 162 to 169 million doses will be distributed this season. So next, on to work group considerations, which focused in the last several months largely around various issues related to influenza vaccines for older adults. Because there are going to be a number of abbreviations used in some of these slides, I thought it would be good to just have a quick reminder of them. Those are all summarized here. We have 3 main types of influenza vaccines: the inactivated vaccines, or IIVs, recombinant influenza vaccine, RIV, and live attenuated influ vaccine, or LAIV. Within the inactivated category, we have several specific types for which we use some specific abbreviations: the cell culture-based vaccine, or CCIIV, the adjuvanted vaccine, or AIIV, and the high-dose inactivated vaccine, or HDIIV. In each case, the numbers that follow the letter designations are indicative of the number of influenza vaccine antigens that are represented in the vaccine, which would be 3 for trivalent and 4 for quadrivalent. So moving on to some just basic context and history about the recommendations for influenza vaccination for older adults, and also influenza in general for older adults. Older adults have been recommended to receive routine annual influenza vaccinations since the early 1960s. This is actually a reproduction of the entirety of the 1960 Surgeon General's statement on influenza immunization, which indicates that we were living in a simpler time back then. It is 1 page. And in that statement, it's noted that there were several groups that were considered to have contributed the most to excess mortality and morbidity during the previous pandemic, which had been 1957. And one of these groups was all persons 65 years of age or older, that you can barely probably see circled at the bottom there. And so that was the sort of start of where we are now. And this is one age group for which the recommendations have been pretty consistent since 1960. That group has always been there. Older adults are still recognized as being generally to be at higher risk for increased severity of illness with influenza and also deaths. And as an example, this is data from CDC's fluserve.net. This slide is generated from FluView Interactive, and it shows cumulative hospitalization rates over the course of 4 influenza seasons, the most recent being the most recent completed season, 18-19. The 65-year and older group is represented by the green line. And you can see, as with many things, flu does vary, and the overall cumulative hospitalizations do differ a bit from season to season. But one thing that's often consistent in most seasons, those 65 years of age and older tend to have the highest hospitalization rates. At the time of the Surgeon General's statement in 1960, we'd had not nearly the diversity of influenza vaccines that we currently have. And this is a slide which is a bit busy, but I'm just going to point out 2 main points. It's intended to be a snapshot of how things have developed in roughly the last 2 decades, since about the 2000-2001 season. These are the number of unique products that were available, not necessarily when they were licensed, that might have been shortly before, by season since 2000-2001 to the current season 2019-20. And we've had for a very long time the trivalent inactivated vaccines. Those are the dark blue at the bottom. You can see LAIV, which is in green, came in a little bit later in 2013. Over time, where you see the solid colors turn to hatched colors, that's where the quadrivalents took over from their previous trivalent counterparts. But in particular, a few that I want to point out are the introduction of the high-dose vaccine in red. That's still a trivalent vaccine, as was noted in the previous presentation, but that may change soon. The adjuvanted inactivated influenza vaccine in pink, and also the recombinant influenza vaccine in orange. That one is in the lighter blue, not orange, which is now a quadrivalent. For the current season, we will have a total of 9 different individual vaccines available, of which 2, the high-dose vaccine and the adjuvanted vaccine, that would be Fluzone High-Dose and Fluad, are licensed specifically for 65 and older, so the population we're talking about today. This slide summarizes the vaccines simply by their FDA-licensed age indication. All of them are listed. The 65-year and older group is at the far right in the last column. And you can see here, basically, if you're going just strictly by age indication, any 8 of those 9 vaccines are considered appropriate by age indication. That includes Fluad and Fluzone High-Dose, in addition to Flublok, the recombinant vaccine, and the various other standard dose inactivated vaccines. Fluad and Fluzone High-Dose were developed specifically for this age group with features that were intended to help promote a stronger immune response in this age group, which is both at higher risk of influenza, but also tends not to respond as well to vaccines. For Fluzone High-Dose, that's by having a higher antigen content, as we've seen. Fluad has MF59 adjuvant. In addition, Flublok, though not licensed specifically for 65 and older, has also been studied specifically in this population. Although, as you can see, for just about every age group, tends to be more than one vaccine that's appropriate if you go by age indication. ACIP recommends simply that a licensed age-appropriate influenza vaccine should be used, and there's no preferential recommendation that's made for any age group, including 65 and older, for any one specific vaccine where there's more than one that's available and appropriate for the given recipient. So the fact that we have as many vaccines as we do, and the growing body of literature that's starting to compare specific vaccine types against one another, brings up some very significant questions about whether and what we can say about whether there's one that's more suitable for any given population age group. And older adults are one of those groups for which we're pondering this, of course. There are some challenges, however, for influenza in particular in assessing the relative benefits of specific vaccines for older adults. One is that, again, we simply have such a large variety of available vaccines. There are 8, again, that are appropriate for this age group just by age indications. We're fortunate in that we have a growing canon of studies and literature comparing the individual vaccine types, but the data are limited for some comparisons that would be relevant to help inform this question for us. There are also a number of factors related to influenza itself. The virus changes, vaccine effectiveness, and probably also the relative effectiveness of different vaccines varies from season to season. And as a result, we can't necessarily be certain that results from one or even a few, even very high quality studies will necessarily generalize across all or most influenza seasons. As we see in the evolving picture of influenza vaccines, we've had a presentation today from Sanofi about the high-dose quadrivalent vaccine. This is a presentation the work group heard. This is not a landscape which is aiming to get any less complicated anytime soon. This slide summarizes some of the data on high-dose vaccine, adjuvanted vaccine, and recombinant vaccine for older adults. I caveat this by saying that this is simply the studies that have looked at lab-confirmed flu outcomes. This is not a comprehensive literature review, but this is summarized in the influenza ACIP statement for the last couple of years. We can see that in each case, high-dose, adjuvanted, and RIV4, there is at least one study that uses a lab-confirmed influenza outcome that suggests that there might be some benefit. There's an RCT for high-dose vaccine that covered 2 seasons, an RCT for recombinant vaccine that covered a single season, and an observational study for the adjuvanted vaccine that covered a single season. In each case, these studies compared the index vaccine to a standard dose unadjuvanted inactivated influenza vaccine. We're at present lacking, there's a dearth of data on these vaccines compared to one another, the high dose, the adjuvanted, and the recombinant vaccine, in studies that look at lab-confirmed flu outcomes. There are, importantly, other studies, however, that look at non-lab flu-confirmed outcomes. They're too numerous to list here, but this brings me to where we're going next. So in the work group, we had a number of discussions in the early part of the summer about planning a systematic review to examine the question that you see here. One of the things that was considered is the fact that our landscape does continue to change. We do have one of these vaccines of interest that's going to be quadrivalent at some point in the near future, assuming it gets licensed. There are likely to be other changes, as seems to be the case with influenza and the vaccines in general. However, the group felt overall that it was time to start summarizing this literature in a systematic fashion, and with the understanding also that we were probably going to have to update it over time. So with that, I have a few slides that summarize a planned systematic review and meta-analysis for influenza vaccines in older adults. I'm presenting it as it's currently framed, but there might be some minor changes. Question is, do the relative benefits and harms of high-dose vaccine, adjuvanted vaccine, and the recombinant vaccine as compared with one another and with other influenza vaccines favor the use of these vaccines over others for persons aged 65 years and older? The population that's relevant for this question for our analysis will be adults aged 65 years and older. Intervention vaccines will include trivalent or quadrivalent high-dose, adjuvanted, or recombinant vaccines, either the U.S. licensed vaccines or, if there are any that fit this other category, those similar in formulation and or manufacture to U.S. licensed vaccines. Comparators, as currently framed, other trivalent or quadrivalent influenza vaccines, again, U.S. licensed or similar in formulation and manufacture to U.S. licensed vaccines, non-influenza control vaccines, placebo, and no vaccine. Most of our more recent discussion has been centered around outcomes, and this is where there are a few things as yet to be finalized, which I anticipate will occur in early November. Because we will be examining relative benefits and harms, we'll of course be looking at both efficacy, effectiveness, and safety endpoints. We plan to examine all influenza A and B. At this point, we plan most likely to do sub-analyses for type and subtype as feasible. Not all papers report these things. Influenza-associated outpatient and emergency visits, hospitalizations, and deaths. Safety outcomes will include systemic and injection site adverse events, serious adverse events or SAEs. Also discussed have been Guillain-Barré syndrome and severe hypersensitivity or anaphylaxis. I anticipate that there will be somewhat more granularity on the safety outcomes in upcoming discussions. Inclusion and exclusion criteria will include peer-reviewed literature without a language restriction with publication dates from 1990 forward. The reason for the 1990 forward date is although most of these vaccines of interest are relatively new to the US, the adjuvanted vaccine was licensed in Europe in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, so we wanted to be able to go a bit far beyond that date. We plan to include randomized studies, retrospective case control and cohort studies, and prospective cohort studies, and to exclude case series, case reports, and registry reports, and other types of documents that don't have comparator information, vaccines not licensed for use in the United States, animal studies, data for which the entire population falls out of the designated age range 65 and older, duplicate reports, and interim reports superseded by finals. So that is the summary of much of what we've been discussing for the last few months. I have to thank the work group greatly for persisting in getting through this. We anticipate that this particular review will be a bit more complicated than the last time we reviewed this particular topic. We last did this in 2015, at which time really all we had was high dose for this age group and a high dose versus standard dose comparison. So really one relevant comparison. This time we have at least three. We anticipate hopefully starting in November, and we will be presenting updates to you as we have them at future meetings. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We'll open it up to questions now. Dr. Fry.
I think I can ask this question. I was just curious if we had any sense of the uptake of adjuvanted vaccine versus high dose. And the reason I ask is I was just curious to know about if there's any way to think about what people preference between the two. Is that a fair question?
I don't have any specific information in terms of trends over time for the uptake of adjuvanted. There is an FDA-authored paper, which was an analysis of CMS data for the 2017-18 season. The intent of that paper was primarily to compare egg-based versus non-egg-based vaccines, but it did cite for that season what their approximate breakdown is for the various vaccine types. Again, just one season, and it was about 13 million CMS Medicare beneficiaries 65 years and older. And if memory serves correctly, it was about 63% high dose. I honestly cannot remember the percent that was adjuvanted, but that's one potential source of information. It, of course, is a snapshot and is not trends over time. I don't know if anybody from that company is in the audience that could address that.
Thank you. Dr. Foster.
Steve Foster, American Pharmacists Association. A couple of years ago, or even a year ago, we had talked about the fact that we had analyzed flu mist but did not analyze the other regular type of doses, and yet here we're not, again, specifically looking at the various products through as a total comparison. And I would hope that someday we would be able to look at that, in other words, make this a little bit broader than it is. But the one concern that I have, or not really concern, but interest I have, is the fact that we talked last year an awful lot about the fact of cell-based versus egg-based product and the effectiveness of that. And yet we did not mention that on the comparison at all, looking to see if that had a factor involved in it. I'd be kind of curious to know.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the mic, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Thank you for bringing that up. We actually did discuss that specifically. I think one of the issues that we are dealing with is that there are data for the cell-based vaccine, increasing data over time, of course. There is a bit more specific data for this age group concerning the other vaccines. And because we already have 3 vaccines of interest, we have somewhat of a complicated analysis on our hands, so we're choosing to focus at this point on those 3. The cell culture-based vaccine also has the interesting distinction that this upcoming season is the first season during which not only is the virus propagated in eggs for manufacture and large-scale production, but this is the first season that we're starting right now where the seed virus, the reference virus provided to the manufacturer, is also a cell-based, a cell-derived virus. So we anticipate that we probably will want to look at that again down the line. But for the moment, this seems to be a fairly large task with the vaccines we have, and they're the most applicable and germane for this age group.
Hunter, Dr. Paul.
So I just wanted to confirm that you're not comparing recombinant versus adjuvanted versus high dose. You're lumping them all into one group and comparing them to everything else?
No.
Oh, you are comparing them to each other?
If we can find the data, yes. Where those data exist, we will compare them. So this is what I meant to convey by the fact that I think we will have at least 3 relevant comparisons here.
Great. And just the timeline one more time. We usually vote in June for what the recommendation is for the upcoming season, right? And we vote in February for the upcoming season.
Sometimes both.
Okay, sometimes both. And at the rate we're going here, we're not going to have that ability to make that decision, vote on that in February, if I'm understanding your timeline. We're not going to have the ability to have the information to make a decision in February. Is that correct?
Ideally, we would have that analysis completed in February, and I believe that's the aim.
Okay, but maybe.
However, it's a complicated undertaking.
Got it. Okay, I just wanted to see if I understood that. Thank you.
Dr. Messonnier.
Yeah, just 2 points. One is, my understanding is that there are 8,000 articles that you're starting with. So
that
I
is
think
correct.
that they're going to make every attempt to pull this together by February, but I don't want to overpromise. The second is just to make a little bit of a distinction between what the ACIP working group is doing and what the overall flu division is doing. Back to the question of egg and cell-based vaccines. In addition to the reviews that Lisa is referring to, our flu division has increased our network of sites where we evaluate flu vaccines, in an attempt to enhance the granularity at which we can look at the distinctions, for example, of cell versus egg. We've also added immunogenicity studies. So outside of the ACIP process, we're proceeding along the same way that we discussed a year ago, which is we need a bigger database in order to provide the kind of data that you're interested in. Anything else?
You know, that's exactly right. And not only that, there are other groups that are also doing studies. And so I do think that the evidence base is going to get bigger and clearer related to cell versus, or egg versus non-egg in the next couple of years.
Dr. Atmar.
Can you expand on the immunogenicity? I mean, that's something that used to be done, and actually some of us have discussed in other fora the potential advantages of having that information available. So I endorse it, but I'm glad to hear it, and I'd like to hear more.
Okay. Introduce myself, Alicia Fry. I'm the branch chief for the Epi and Prevention branch in the Influenza division. We have several studies with immunogenicity outcomes focused on different groups. One is in older adults, and we'd be happy to present those studies to the working group so you have an overview. I think it's good to hear that you feel that those are interesting. We have 1 year with 5 different arms, and the second year we re-randomize, and then we vaccinate for a 3rd year with the same vaccine. So we look at repeat vaccination effects and some maybe potential differences if you switch vaccines, like adjuvant or high dose. So we have a study ongoing in Hong Kong right now looking at that. And the first year data were just presented at Options and should be published soon. We have several studies in younger age groups. Healthcare workers, again, most of what we focus on are not only the initial effects, but the repeat vaccination effects, because we think that will be an important consideration with all of these vaccines. And then trying to tease out some of the immunological differences, which I think are still softer outcomes for us, trying to understand some of the maybe potential benefits. But we would be happy to give an update to the working group or to all ACIP at a future date if you guys would like that.
Any other questions? Dr. Bernstein.
With the earlier, I thought we heard that there was it was a surprise, the B lineage, especially the Yamagata in some parts. And I was wondering at what point would we expect to only have quadrivalent vaccines available for adults? Pediatric population is all quadrivalent now. And at what point would we expect to have only quadrivalent for adults, especially 65 and older?
That's a good question. We know currently from what you've seen for the Sanofi presentation today, what's on the horizon potentially for the high-dose vaccine. I think for the adjuvanted vaccine, we have not yet had a work group presentation on that. It would be best if that were addressed if anyone from Securus were here, if they have a timeline regarding that. But at this point, those are the last two, is the high-dose and the adjuvanted for this season. And one would anticipate that would change to all quadrivalent at some point.
Comment, please. Introduce yourself.
From Securus. We do have a quadrivalent adjuvanted product that's in front of the FDA now, and our action date is in February of 2020. So I hope to present that data at the February meeting.
Thank you. We look forward to that. Any other comments, questions? Yes, go ahead, Dr. Pelling.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the systematic review that's going to be done, and I recognize the complexity of it. I do have a question about, I wanted to ask about intradermal vaccines because that's another one that isn't being mentioned. And I don't want to make this more complicated than it already is, and I just would like you to comment on the intradermal.
Currently, the intradermal vaccine isn't available in the US. I believe it might be available in other places. There have been also in some other countries an intradermal vaccine license that's a higher dose than what we had licensed here of antigen. We plan to include other influenza vaccines broadly. The case of the intradermal is a little bit interesting because on the one hand, it's relevant here because it is still licensed, it's just not available. That's something we could include. I anticipate that we would not see as many literature citations for that one, but that's something we can think about.
Anything else? Okay, so I thank you all for your presentations. We have a 15-minute break, so why don't we come back at 3:20? Thank you very much.